Welcome to So Very Easy. My name is Laura, and it is time for the free follow along block of the month from Quilting Confections called Rainbow Sorbet. Now, this has been a free follow along that they've offered free to us, and we are on block number 19. Block 19 looks like we have a square and a square and a square with these lovely pointed arms. Will be background fabric, and we need 4 3.5-inch squares, 2 5.5-inch squares. Fabric A, 2 5.5-inch squares, B, 4 4.5-inch squares, and C and D, 2 4.5-inch squares. Now the directions do tell us to pre-cut our squares into triangles, but there's another way we can do it, and we can cut them after the sewing. We can put aside the 4 background fabric squares at 3.5 inches. Those are going to remain squares. That center block, we need to have 4 half square triangles. We're going to use fabric C and D. Place right sides together, draw a line from corner to corner, and we need to stitch on each side of those lines. Once the stitching has been done, we're going to be able to cut those apart. These will need to be turned into 3.5-inch squares. Throughout the project, we have been using the Quiltin' Day 6.5-inch triangle square up ruler. This allows us to cut the squares before we've pressed them open. For the 3.5-inch square, we need to find that 3.5-inch line. That red line sits right on top of the stitching line. We have our seam allowance past that 3.5-inch line. Just take the rotary cutter and cut off that extra. When we open this up, we're going to have that 3.5-inch square. We can trim off those dog ears before we press this open. Just take a pair of scissors and snip in so that we have a little point at the corner. No threads are being trimmed, just that little extra fabric. We will need 4 of these half square triangles at 3.5 inches. We need to press 2 blocks with the seams going in one direction and 2 blocks with the seams going in the opposite direction. We need to stitch these together, and having those seams in opposite directions means they're going to nestle together. So we can stitch the blocks together with D's all in the center. As you stitch the center together, continue having the seams going in opposite directions, and all of those seams will nestle together, so we will keep those nice sharp points. We now have those 4 center pieces done. The 4 white corners we don't need to do anything with. We need to make these extra shapes. The directions have us cut the squares into triangles, lay them out, and sew them in this order, because we do have the little points going in opposite directions. But there is another way we can do it without cutting all of these pieces first. And we need to start with fabric B and the background fabric. And they were both cut at 5.5-inch squares. We can treat these 2 squares the same as we do half square triangles. Putting right sides together, draw a line from corner to corner, and stitch that 1/4 inch from each side. Cut them apart and press the fabric going to the dark side. We do not need to trim these down or do anything with them except to put fabric B on top. Before we put fabric B on top, let's draw a line from corner to corner to all 4 B's. Once the lines have been put on, we're going to be able to take the fabric B and put it on top of these half square triangles. That drawn line is going to be opposite to the sewn line. And the bottom's bigger than the top, so it's going to make it really easy. We just need to match up these 2 corners with the seam. Put a little dollop of glue on the corner, have it match up to the point, and glue these 2 points down. That's going to save us some time in the next step. From here, we need to stitch on either side of that line using a 1/4 inch seam allowance. Cut them apart on that blue line that we drew in the center going from corner to corner. Before we remove the glue, we can trim these down to be 3.5-inch squares. It's a lot easier to trim from the side where we did that first seam. The ruler is designed so it only sits on stitching lines. Here's the 3.5-inch square up line with our seam allowance, and that center line right on top of our stitching line. So we have the seam allowance on one or the other side. We can now trim this down. That little point that's been glued on the underside is going to stay nice and tight and not slip as we're trimming. When we remove that, we're going to have that 3.5-inch square that we're looking for. We can also trim off the dog ears. From each piece, we will end up with 2 of these units, and the units are going to have the top piece reversed. So we'll have one with the purple on the left and one with it on the right, and that's exactly what we're looking for. So trim all 4 of these squares to make 8 of these units. 4 in one direction, 4 in another. To press these little units, we need to take one set and have the seam going in one direction, and the other set having the seam going in the opposite direction. We now have all the pieces that we need to make the block. The 4 corner pieces and the center is already together. The 2 larger bees are going to go together in the center, so it makes a triangle. So this background fabric is going to be shown all the way around the outside. So we could pick these up and move them all the way around the block. From there, we have the white corner squares. We can stitch the top and the bottom rows together. We can match up those triangles, and those seams are opposite, so we're going to be able to nestle them together, and then put the 2 white ends on. And we can do that to the top piece and the bottom piece. And we'll do these after. To press the top and the bottom seams, have the white blocks coming out, and for those center seams, have them going in the opposite direction of the seams that they're going to match. We can now sew these 2 blocks together, matching them up, 1/4 inch seam. These 2 seams are going to be pressed in the opposite direction of the 2 seams they're going to sew up against. And then we can stitch those 2 onto that center. These 2 seams need to be pressed in, and that will let all of those seams nestle together. Sew the top and the bottom on. Block number 19 is now done. If you've been following along, you know I've been making a second block with scrappy fabric. Where they have had a light background, I have been using a dark background, and I have no idea who made this fabric. It's an old fabric that was given to me. So I have my 4 corners cut out the same measurements. I have the 4 blocks to make the center, and my 8 blocks that have those opposite points to them. All 16 of these blocks are 3.5 inches, so there's a lot of rearranging we can do. The first thing is we can switch this center so that it doesn't look like a square. We can also switch up our center pieces so that that large triangle doesn't make a triangle at all. We now have created a star, and by making that star, we end up with little squares in between each of those star points. We can also switch up those 4 corners to the centers. It will make that center look like one big block, and then we can do lots with the corner in any direction that we want. Having all of these blocks the same size gives us a lot of design opportunity. I'm going to sew it together the way it's been suggested. Block 19 is now done, and once again the fabric really makes a huge difference. There's 1 block left to go, and then we get to put it all together. I'll put a link in the description to Quilting Confections, which has been giving us this free follow-along block of the month. And I'll see you next month. Thank you for joining me today on Sew Very Easy. Feel free to subscribe, and as always, come on back. Let's see what we're sewing next time in the sewing room. Bye for now.